Will Chris Paul ever win an NBA championship in his career? Let's get into this. Quickly before we get the video started, if you guys enjoyed this video and want to see more NBA content just like this one, hit that subscribe button and that post notification bell. Anyways, back to the video. Ever since Chris Paul was drafted into the NBA, Chris Paul was always known as a superstar. Chris Paul was very effective in terms of his scoring ability, but when you go around and ask an NBA fan what's the first thing they think of when they think of Chris Paul, typically most people are going to tell you they think about his passing and playmaking ability. Chris Paul was just so efficient and effective at that, always getting his teammates involved, always making the right pass in the right time, just being a great decision maker out there and a very cerebral player out there. Chris Paul is the definition of a player coach out there. And honestly, Chris Paul is probably the best, if not one of the best passers and playmakers of our generation. When you actually look back at what Chris Paul was able to accomplish throughout his career, there was obviously a ton he was able to accomplish. Chris Paul was always either the leader or in the top 5 in terms of assist numbers. Of course, as I mentioned before in the video, he's probably the best or one of the best passers and playmakers of our generation. Chris Paul basically made the All-Star team every single year ever since he's gotten into the NBA. Chris Paul was always known as a guy that was a top-tier superstar in the league for years to come. Of course, Chris Paul had accomplished a ton of different things within his career, but one critique you could definitely make about Chris Paul is he's great during the regular season. He always has his teams very high in terms of their win totals, and they're always very high in terms of the seeding, either in the Western Conference or the Eastern Conference, whatever. His teams are always very good, especially when you look at the Clippers specifically. But when it actually came down to the playoffs, that's kind of where he struggled. There was a few different issues with Chris Paul. There was one issue where he would just get injured every time it came down to the playoffs and he was kind of worn down. And the other issue was Chris Paul would just straight up not play well enough to actually advance in the playoffs and actually make some noise in the playoffs. But starting off with the injury thing, there's one of two different ways you can actually look at it. The first way is the fact that Chris Paul would just get injured in the playoffs when it came down to it. You can look at that, maybe it's just being very unfortunate and there's nothing really he can do. Of course, any player in the NBA and in any sport can get injured at any time. And maybe you can just say that those were freak injuries and it was just overall, it was just very unfortunate that it happened during the playoffs or going into the playoffs. Or there's another way that you can actually look at it, which is Chris Paul maybe should have paced himself a little better during the regular season, maybe not play every single game during the regular season and really wear himself out. Or you could say maybe Chris Paul should have been in a little bit of a better shape to actually be able to withstand the 82 game season and also be able to be fresh enough to actually play effectively in the playoffs and not get injured. But looking at both sides of the coin, I definitely think there's some truth to both sides. Of course, any player could get injured, and it's not necessarily Chris Paul's fault that he got injured going into the playoffs. But when you look at the fact that Chris Paul also got injured during every single playoffs, basically, there's obviously a trend there, and that's not a great look for him. But overall, I definitely do think there's some truth to both sides of the coin. But after Chris Paul's up and down career with the Los Angeles Clippers, he was actually traded to the Houston Rockets to team up with James Harden. And now there's a ton of excitement because Chris Paul would finally have a teammate like James Harden, who was an MVP candidate and one of the best players in the NBA. Blake Griffin was definitely a very good player as well. DeAndre Jordan was a decent player as well in Los Angeles, but obviously neither one of those players are near the level of James Harden. So there's a ton of excitement that Chris Paul was joining up with James Harden in Houston. In their first season together, Chris Paul and James Harden, it worked out perfectly. During the regular season, the Rockets were just great, and when it came down to the playoffs, their new style of two different guys just isolating Chris Paul and James Harden was really working. The Rockets kind of breezed through the whole entire playoffs until they got into the Western Conference Finals against the Golden State Warriors, which is the whole reason they brought in Chris Paul in the first place, the Houston Rockets. And of course, you all know those Golden State Warriors were absolutely ridiculous. Of course, they had Steph Curry, Klay Thompson, Draymond Green, and also Kevin Durant at the time as well. They were an absolute super team, and people saw the Golden State Warriors as absolutely unbeatable. But the Rockets actually matched up against the Warriors pretty effectively. And at one point, the best point for the Houston Rockets, they were actually up 3-2 going back into Houston, and a lot of people thought at that point the Rockets probably should win that playoff series against the Warriors at a time when nobody thought any team could ever beat this Warriors team. They were just too talented. But of course, in Game 6, going into Houston, the Rockets up 3-2, just one win away of actually making it all the way to the NBA Finals. Chris Paul actually injures his hamstring and isn't able to play. And as a result, the Rockets actually lost Game 6 after an historically bad shooting night for them. They missed 28 three-point shots in a row, which is just ridiculous. But the Rockets ended up losing Game 6, and then Chris Paul did end up coming back for Game 7, but he clearly literally was injured at that point, and then the Warriors ended up winning Game 7 and making it all the way to the NBA Finals once again. And for Chris Paul, once again, he was falling short for making it all the way to the NBA Finals at the very least. And there was two sides of the coin. A lot of NBA fans thought that was the best chance Chris Paul would ever have to actually winning an NBA championship, and now that he didn't actually win it, he was never going to win one. But there was also some people that were pretty optimistic based on how well the Rockets actually played the Warriors, and they thought maybe in a rematch in the following season, the Rockets may be actually able to win if they don't just miss 28 straight three-point shots in a row like they did in Game 6. But unfortunately for Chris Paul, his career kind of started to go in a downwards decline from there. After a really good first season with the Houston Rockets, his next season definitely was not good whatsoever. The style that the Rockets were playing, where two guys, Chris Paul and James Harden, would take turns isolating, was starting to not work as well as it did in the first season, and teams were finally starting to figure that out. And when it came down to the NBA playoffs, they really struggled a lot and just were not the same team whatsoever. And after that Houston run, the general manager in Houston just decided to move on from Chris Paul, and at that point, Chris Paul's value was at an all-time low. He was just giving an insane contract, paying him around $45 million per year, and at that point, a lot of people saw that as a negative, and Chris Paul was, at that point, a player that a lot of teams didn't want due to that contract, and his value for him personally was at an all-time low. But then the Houston Rockets were actually able to find a trade partner in the OKC Thunder, and they traded him there. And at that point, a lot of people thought that Chris Paul's career was basically done at that point. He was no longer going to be the same player that we all knew. But this is kind of where Chris Paul really turned his career around. Chris Paul played fantastic for the OKC Thunder. He took a team that nobody thought was anywhere near to the playoffs and more of a rebuilding team, actually to the 6th seed, and made it all the way to the playoffs. He helped so many different players on the team perform so well, especially Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, where Chris Paul was a huge part in the success that SGA actually had so quickly. And at that point, Chris Paul was just seen as an amazing mentor, and actually, he was still seen as a player that was pretty good on the court. He was still putting up pretty good numbers in terms of his scoring ability. He was pretty efficient, and of course, Chris Paul still had that same IQ that he's had throughout his entire career. That's not going to go away. And also, Chris Paul was still a great passer at that point. So Chris Paul kind of revived his career with the OKC Thunder. And yeah, he was still getting paid a pretty big contract, but he was kind of, at that point, he was kind of showing his worth, which is a really good thing for CP3 going forward. And after that very successful season for CP3, he actually got traded from the OKC Thunder to the Phoenix Suns. It was more so due to the fact, not that the Thunder didn't like Chris Paul, but they were kind of just going in a different direction. Of course, they were rebuilding, and Chris Paul at that point wanted to win in his career, so they definitely weren't on the same timetable, and they decided to trade him to the Phoenix Suns. And this is where Chris Paul's career really turned around for the better. In Chris Paul's first season with the Phoenix Suns, which was the previous NBA season we just went through, he played fantastic. Him and Devin Booker meshed very, very well. And during the regular season, the Phoenix Suns were actually the #1 overall seed in the Western Conference, which is very impressive any year, but especially due to the fact that they were playing in the Western Conference was very impressive for them. Chris Paul was playing great, of course, but the thing about Chris Paul, what he does best is make everyone else around him better, and he was doing that very effectively. He was getting young guys like Mikal Bridges to play a lot better, DeAndre Ayton specifically playing the pick and roll with him. He was playing a lot better as well with Chris Paul, and overall the Suns were just looking very good going into the playoffs. But once they actually got to the NBA playoffs, their first round matchup was against the Los Angeles Lakers, who a lot of people thought the Lakers were actually going to win the championship that year. But luckily for the Suns, they actually beat the Los Angeles Lakers in the first round. But still, a lot of people didn't think the Suns were actually going to win the championship or even make it all the way to the NBA Finals at that point. They were still the Utah Jazz in the playoffs. They were still the Los Angeles Clippers, who a lot of people thought were better than the Suns. But luckily for the Suns, they actually went all the way to the Western Conference Finals, and then eventually they went all the way into the NBA Finals. And for Chris Paul, this is the first time in his career that he was actually playing in the NBA Finals. And at that point, in that finals matchup versus Milwaukee Bucks, virtually everybody thought the Phoenix Suns were going to win that playoff series, and Chris Paul was going to win his first ever NBA championship. But of course, unfortunately for Chris Paul and the Phoenix Suns, the Milwaukee Bucks actually came back and ended up winning that NBA championship. Although Chris Paul and the Phoenix Suns definitely had some nice moments, of course they didn't actually win the NBA championship. But at this point, the real question about Chris Paul is, after having some opportunities, could Chris Paul actually ever win an NBA championship? Well, Chris Paul just re-signed a new contract with the Phoenix Suns, and I think the Phoenix Suns are a good organization and a good spot for Chris Paul at this point in his career. They're definitely a very good team, and they're definitely a bunch of young players on the team, so they are up and coming and ascending, I should say. But I feel like that previous season with the Phoenix Suns, where they made it all the way to the NBA Finals, was probably the best chance Chris Paul is ever going to have to winning an NBA championship. Although the Suns could come into next season playing a lot better than they did the previous season, that's definitely plausible. You also have to look around the NBA, and you would think the Los Angeles Lakers for sure are going to be a lot better than they were this previous season. You look at the Brooklyn Nets, they're going to be a lot better. Even if the Suns are able to make it to the finals, they're going to probably have to play the Brooklyn Nets. Also, the Clippers, I would say, got a little bit better as well. There's so many different teams that just got a lot better during the offseason, specifically the Lakers for me personally. And I think it's going to be very, very difficult for the Suns to actually beat a team like the Lakers. So in my opinion, I think Chris Paul's a great player. He had a great career, but I don't know if he's ever going to win an NBA championship going forward. But anyways, let me know what you guys think in the comments. Do you guys think Chris Paul is ever going to win an NBA championship going forward, or do you guys not think so? But anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and if you did enjoy, please leave a like and subscribe and hit that post notification bell. It really helps me out a lot. Until the next time, peace out, guys.